Hello, my name is Woo-Hyun John, working at RCCC Research Center. June setting for keynote speech is ready, so whenever you want to start, you need to start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to start. So, good morning and welcome everybody. On behalf of microphone. Okay. So, on behalf of the ABRN conveners and RCCZ, I would like to introduce to you and welcome our second keynote speaker, Dr. Frank Billet. So this is of course to those who don't know him already for his fascinating work. Since Frank and I met first on the neighboring China workshop organized by Martin Sachser and Zhang Zhuang at NSU 10 years ago, we are in contact, and I am closely following his fascinating work focusing on space, borders and territoriality, as he summarized it. Frank is a cultural anthropologist and geographer, which is a very fruitful combination indeed. Currently, he's a program director at the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, and affiliated still also with the Mongolia and Inner Asia Studies Unit at the University of Cambridge, which also reflects his prime regional focus of research, which are the borderlands of China, Russia and Mongolia. Frank over the years has published deeply inspiring ethnographic and conceptual work, with the latter especially scrutinizing the multidimensionality of space in the context of state power and cartographic representations. Just to name a few of his recent books, one is Voluminous States, Sovereignty, Materiality, and the Territorial Imagination, published with Duke University Press, and his fascinating account Sinophobia, Anxiety, Violence, and the Making of Mongolian Identity, published with University of Hawaii Press. Unfortunately, Frank cannot be here with us in person, but I would like to give the word to him now in what must be late afternoon or early evening in the Bay Area. So please, Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henrik, for this very kind introduction. Can you hear me? Everybody hear me fine? Yeah? Yes. Okay. I'm assuming that you do. Okay. So first of all, I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this lecture. I was hoping, as Henrik said, to be able to deliver it in person, as was indeed the original plan 2 years ago, and to be able to attend the many panels and catch up with friends and colleagues. But the birth of my daughter 3 weeks ago has changed disrupted those plans, and so I had to join virtually. I'm going to try and share my screen. I can't? Is it possible for me to share my screen? I think maybe I need to change my status. Hello?
We're working on it.
Thank you.
Sorry. 이승찬 조교님, 거기 스크린 쉐어 모두 다 할 수 있게 만들어 주세요.
Okay, should be working. Does it look okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So my talk today is a shortened version of one of the chapters of the book I'm currently finishing, provisionally titled Somatic States on Cartography, Geobodies, Bodily Integrity. The book is a study of the conceptual link between the nation state and the body. One of the core questions it poses is why nation-states are willing to expend such enormous amounts of financial and human resources to secure minuscule pieces of land, and why so many ordinary citizens are ready to sacrifice their lives for set pieces. Answers to these questions tend to be addressed through rationality and security, with a predominant focus on migration and economics. Instead, somatic states foreground the corporeal analogies that sustain these bordering efforts, and suggest that this language is not simply poetic, but that it reflects a genuine and visceral association of the individual body with the national outline, or logo map, and that this identification has been greatly facilitated by the emergence of the national map. In this paper, I look specifically at territorial entities that depart from the standard state model, such as colonial dominions, enclaves, and other atomized and fractured national spaces. I suggest that the emergence of the logo map, freed from all geographical shackles and dislocated from its neighbors, was made possible through the active suppression of similarities, connections, and overlaps. The visually unambiguous logo map, however, is paralleled by the uncanny shadowy figure of the monstrous and the concorporate, which threatens to disrupt the idealized portrayal of the nation-state as autonomous and independent, a terror we can trace in fragmented territorial forms. My overall theoretical aim in this paper is to challenge certain assumptions about the state, and in particular the post-Westphalian assumption that the state should be homogeneous, continuous, and discrete. Starting off with examples of state fractures and discontinuities, I argue that the recent work of philosophers on molten human entanglements and symbiotic assemblages, as well as the insight of cultural theorists about the place of the monster in contemporary culture, can help us reimagine forms of geopolitics that are both entangled and collaborative. My hope is that this line of thinking will intersect productively with the themes of the conference, particularly those of zones and coexistence. In the early 1970s, American artist Gordon Matta Clark discovered that the city of New York periodically auctioned off gutter space, residual parcels resulting from anomalies in zoning, surveying, and public works expansion. Intrigued by the idea of ownable but unoccupiable and frequently inaccessible space, Matta Clark purchased the deeds to 15 of these microplots of land, slivers of curbsides and alleyways, for between $25 and $75 apiece. Over the next years, he collected the maps, deeds, and other bureaucratic documentation attached to the slivers, which combined with maps and montaged images of each site, formed this project Fake Estates. This concept of anarchitecture and conflation of the words anarchy and architecture, indexing a focus on voids, gaps, and leftover spaces, echoes the attention this paper places on gaps, fractures, and places that remain unaccounted for. Focusing on fractured space, such as political enclaves, on erratic and negative spaces like archipelagos, and finally on what I term the monstrous, this paper is concerned with spaces where the logo map resolutely departs from the ideal of the nation-state with which we are familiar. Detached and fragmented, enclaves are a remarkably rare phenomenon in contemporary political geography. They are technically a subset of the larger family of political fragments, which are non-contiguous parts of a nation's territory. Fragments can include islands belonging to a larger landmass, such as the state of Hawaii in relation to the United States mainland, or to contiguous outlying territory, such as the state of Alaska. Enclaves refer specifically to parts of sovereign territory wholly surrounded by another sovereign state. The largest and most intricate enclave complex was located until 2015 across the India-Bangladesh border. Known as the Chitma House, it consisted of 102 Indian enclaves on Bangladesh territory and of 71 Bangladeshi enclaves within India's mainland. This spatial enmeshment was complicated further by the existence of counter-enclaves and even a unique case worldwide, a counter-enclave, a tiny piece of Indian territory in a fragment of Bangladesh, itself within a piece of India within Bangladesh. While these enclaves were commonly imagined as being walled or at least clearly demarcated, they were neither territorially isolated nor had their boundaries signposted on the ground. This invisibility did not, however, spell freedom of movement. On the contrary, residents of these enclaves were often described as stateless, since they lived in zones outside of official administration, and that officials of one country could not cross the sovereign frontier to administer territory. In September 2011, after decades of attempts at a resolution, the governments of India and Bangladesh finally announced their intention to resolve the issue through a land swap, giving residents the choice of nationality. While the resolution was largely prompted by the considerable human suffering they caused, as well as the difficulties for both states to administer such labyrinthine geography, there was also the sense that the enclaves were anachronistic and that both India and Bangladesh needed to regularize their border to become fully aligned on modern models. Enclaves are indeed anachronistic, since they are the vestiges of political organizations based on patronage that could vary from village to village rather than on territorially defined sovereignty. This incompatibility between these two logics of sovereignty is one that does not sit well within the contemporary organization of geopolitical space. Terms such as surreal and absurd, the pervasive analysis of the Chitma House, have also been used to refer to the complex mosaic of post-Soviet Central Asia, a political geography that evokes similarly negative evaluations. The Byzantine geography of the latter is routinely summarized as symptomatic of a perverse Soviet scheme to make them unworkable, which is not an entirely fair assessment. These were effectively administrative and internal boundaries, in this sense not unlike some of the more extreme forms of gerrymandering in the United States, and never envisaged to one day become international borders. Regardless of intent, they have caused significant harm in the post-Soviet era, inhibiting human movement and restricting access to natural resources, water in particular. A very different set of enclave complexes are the ones found in Europe, the most extensive and convoluted of which is Bale-Hertog and Bale-Nassau, two towns enmeshed into one single urban entity across the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. Unlike the fraught situation in the Chitma House, Central Asia, or the fractured Palestinian territory, Bale is a place devoid of local and colonial anxieties. As a result, Bale has been largely dismissed as a curious but ultimately irrelevant case study by border theorists. Yet, the territorial logic that operates in Bale is the same we find at work elsewhere, namely that every inch of the territory must be controlled and that borders should be unambiguously marked. In fact, the highly fractured and miniature scale of the environment makes it a truly fascinating place where inconsistencies, breaches, and ambiguities in the ideas of territorial sovereignty are laid bare. On a total of just 32 square miles, of over 32 square miles, the two towns are intertwined into one another. Situated only 3 miles away from the Belgian mainland, the Belgian town of Bale-Hertog is made up of 22 exclaves, with the remaining territory around it forming the Dutch town of Bale-Nassau. Some of the enclaves are truly minuscule, no larger than 3,000 square yards. This territorial jigsaw is compounded by the irregularity of the shapes of the enclaves, which means an individual may cross the border 5 or 6 times on their way to the cornerstone. The borderlines slice seemingly haphazardly across fields, streets, office buildings, and private homes, creating an intricate mosaic of national sovereignties, each with its own specific tax, traffic, and labor laws. Like other enclaves elsewhere in Europe, Bale's case is a vestigial relic of a medieval spatial logic premised on vassalage and ties of fealty, rather than territoriality. Following the Treaty of Westphalia, European states attempted to eradicate many of them through delimitation treaties and conquest, but Bale, never important or irksome enough to get to the top of anyone's to-do list, remained a notable exception. In fact, not only was there little incentive to iron out the territorial messiness, but the few attempts at doing so through treaties and land swaps were actively resisted by the residents, who found the existing situation to their advantage. Practices of evasion have been central to life in Bale, and its inhabitants are immensely proud of their ability to navigate the town's tortuous spatiality. Today, with Belgium and the Netherlands part of the European Union, differences between the two halves have been much attenuated. Baaler-Hertog and Baaler-Nassau share a currency, and many laws and regulations are being standardized. The two towns work closely together in the provision of services and co-run by national operations such as the fire station and the sewage treatment facility. The readiness of those municipalities to make it work is held up by locals as an example of how Europeans can live together in an increasingly homogeneous European Union. Baaler likes to tout itself as a European laboratory, an example of harmonious cohabitation in a mixed environment. More importantly, perhaps, Baaler shines a light on the very principles and mechanics of territorial sovereignty. The length to which both municipalities go to adhere to this political idea, despite the challenges imposed by Baaler's fractal geography, makes it a fascinating case study. Indeed, if they supply services to their respective residents and dutifully share the costs of road, air, and illumination pro rata down to the square meter, the two municipalities in fact tacitly agree on the convenient fiction that they are entirely distinct. And yet, despite careful and extensive demarcation, separation is ultimately illusory, given that the border crosses numerous dwellings, which for administrative and fiscal purposes need to be located in only one of the two municipalities. The established practice to have the front door determine national affiliation means that buildings are treated as singular rather than the spatial hybrids that they actually are. The reality that a given house is not entirely in Belgium or the Netherlands is well understood. But for reasons of convenience, it is treated legally and jurisdictionally as if it were. So while Baaler's surface is unambiguously marked, the complex of enclaves is in fact an elastic space, a distorted grid where borders are routinely twisted into a workable space in order to make this very partition possible. Such distortions, due in Baaler to the physical constraints imposed by the miniaturized nature of the town's enclaves, are in fact quite common. There are special economic zones and corridors, territories that states control but do not have sovereignty over. There are territories and dependencies where citizens have fewer rights, and islands where the rules of the mainland do not apply. Such empirical spaces of legal suspension, in the phrasing of Madeleine Reeves, have proliferated in recent decades, particularly in relation to migration mechanisms. From the Eskimo naval base in British Columbia, which was designed in 1999 as not yet Canada, so that 600 Chinese migrants could not claim refugee status, to the island of Nauru, which has performed asylum processing services for payment on behalf of Australia. The gap between the legal definition of territorial sovereignty and actual practices on the ground appears to be widening. Recent border literature has done much to expose the resistant fiction that political borders and territorial sovereignty are coextensive, even if power differentials, specifically which states have sufficient clout to bend the rules, often remains unexamined. Numerous hyphenated terms have been introduced by social science and political scholars in order to account for the non-linearity, non-homogeneity, and non-continuity of political borders. While these forms of incomplete sovereignty are useful to unpack the spatial formation of neoliberal economies, interpreting territorial discontinuities through exceptionalism reinscribes the Westphalian model as the norm. These kinds of liminal spaces, Sandro Mezzadra and Breit and Nielsen have written, provide a privileged perspective on globalization and its accompanying tensions, frictions, and conflicts. The bordering technologies that make these spaces possible intertwine with state borders and contribute to the formation of new territorial assemblages for the workings of governmentality and sovereignty. In fact, I would argue that these spatial and temporal exceptions function as instruments designed to work within the agreed system without having to challenge core tenets. Instead of actual exceptions, then, they constitute internal devices inherent to the inner workings of territorial sovereignty. Further, like the colonies, far-flung territories and dependencies I discuss in the next section, spatial and temporal enclaves are extraneous to the local map and as such remain largely visible. their ambiguous sovereignty status making them even more difficult to represent graphically. These spaces speak to the central argument developed in this paper, namely that the visual clarity of the logo map is made possible and sustained through practices that twist and distort the territorial ideal of modern political geography. Operating side by side with the logo map, they constitute its negative doppelganger, driven by the unsaid, the unconscious, the repressed, and the monstrous. The actual working of the logo map will be discussed in the final part of this paper. The intervening section, however, will first look at a set of territorial forms and phenomena I bring together under the collective rubric of negative space. Spaces are defined by both a lack and an absence, unwanted, unmarked, invisible, as well as spaces traced and delineated by the presence of others. The concept of terra nullius, nobody's land, emerged in the 18th century on the basis of Roman law, res nullius, nobody's thing. By the early 20th century, it was used productively by various European states to claim land on the basis of first discovery, but often also on the basis of effective occupation, thus enabling European states to claim land on which indigenous populations live. The fact that only one true terra nullius remains, the section of Antarctica, speaks volume about the insatiable hunger for territory that has been characteristic of modern geopolitics. Every last parcel of the rest of the terrestrial world, regardless of elevation, climate, or inhabitability, is someone's sovereign territory, nominally, if not in actual practice. True relinquishment of political space are exceedingly rare. While they do not constitute unwanted spaces, buffers constitute nonetheless what I term negative space, insofar as they form sacrificial zones from where state presence is seen to retreat. As I've discussed elsewhere, in buffer zones, states come to the mutual agreement to forsake the contact area of varying depth. The common type are demilitarized zones, such as those running across the island of Cyprus or the Korean Peninsula. At the Korean DMZ, the site to which I will return later in this chapter, North and South Korea are separated by a 2.5 mile wide demilitarized zone. Demilitarized zones, just like buffer states, feature a strong temporal dimension. They are imagined as transitory phenomena destined to eventually disappear upon resolution of the conflict that led to their creation. Similarly, spatial categories such as no man's lands, cordon sanitaire, no-fly zones, and safe zones, even if they all differ in origin, impulse, and aspiration, resemble buffer zones in that they are liminal frontier zones characterized by restricted access for civilians and non-local populations, if not for all. Expanding the concept of buffers to all forms of territorial liminalities and articulatory spaces between political states helps underscore the ubiquity of transitional sites that tend to remain invisible in both cartography and the political imagination. The political concept of buffer, too frequently relegated by geographers and social theorists to its narrow historical usage, speaks to entanglements and overlaps that resemble pre-Westphalian political geographies. Reconfigured in this way, buffers constitute less a space separating two entities than a zone connecting them, leading to productive assemblages that challenge the very ideal of the state as discrete and autonomous. In particular, the idea of backyard, discussed below, evokes the tension between the apparent stable boundaries of the state and its much more ambiguous incarnation. As a space that is outside the house, yet still within the realm of the domestic, the backyard is a useful metaphor of liminality and buffering. In its primary context of home ownership, a backyard refers to the outdoor, but domestic, space beyond the prying eyes of neighbors. In geopolitics, usage of the concept of backyard to refer to a neighboring area where a state is invested and within which actions by enemy or competing powers may be feared or seen as provocative, originated with the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century. That the concept should have been adopted in political geography to designate spaces beyond the sovereign reach of the state, instead of a less loaded term such as neighborhood, is noteworthy. It appropriates those extraterritorial spaces into the realm of the domestic, thus directly running counter to the cartographic practices characteristic of the post-Westphalian political order. the dimension of ownership present in the original context also deserves notice in that it endures in the selective mobilization of the term. Backyard is routinely used for world powers such as the United States, Russia, or the European Union, but speaking of a backyard in the context of a small country is somewhat absurd. Similarly, the area designated as backyard tends to denote a state comparatively weaker, thus in the context of the United States, clearly referring to the unequal relations with Central and South America rather than Canada. While not precisely equivalent, the Russian concept of near abroad, bližnje zarubizhe, covers similar semantic ground as the US backyard. In the context of post-socialist Russia, near abroad has come to denote, from a Russian perspective, the 15 independent states that emerged after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Like for the United States, these blurry zones between the domestic and the here newly foreign is a zone strategically vital to Russian interests, where outside interference is perceived to constitute a direct existential threat. As Gerald Toll notes, many in the West hear the phrase near abroad as a reluctance on the part of Russia to acknowledge the full sovereignty of the new post-Soviet states. The semantic range of the term extends, however, beyond that. It does denote a long-standing spatial entanglement, but also acknowledges a new arrangement of sovereignty and annual familiarity, as well as indexes a range of geopolitical emotions. The current war in Ukraine, waged by Russia, certainly demonstrates the enduring phantomic force exerted by the 15 states previously contained within Russia's Soviet footprint. Linked to the spatial edges, fragment, and remainders discussed at the beginning of this piece, in the context of Martha Clark's An Architecture in New York, the question of backyard in its aerial urban form has been primarily linked to property overhangs and unobstructed views. In a hot property market, the empty space above a building can translate into tens of millions of dollars. In New York, where every building is zoned to be a certain height, a building that doesn't use its full allotment of vertical space can sell that right to a neighboring building. Once the air right has been sold and the opportunity to grow surrendered, the adjacent building is then in a position to guarantee residents unobstructed vistas. As a result, the air above, behind, to the left or right might be worth far more than the building that carries the rights to it. Thinking of urban space in this way is helpful, since the notion of backyard that was smuggled into geopolitics also carried this dimension of extensibility beyond the state's physical footprint. Non-contiguous territorial fragments, overseas military bases, as well as dependent territories, complicate political cartographies and ambiguous representations. The visually tidy logo map, which Benedict Anderson described as free of neighbors and geographical context, is an ideal more easily supported by those states that are standalone, such as islands, without colonial extensions and of somewhat regular shape. Non-contiguous fragments frequently fall out of political maps. Similarly, colonies and overseas possessions are difficult, if not impossible, to represent. France's spatially neat hexagon is only the tip of the spatial iceberg that the country constitutes. Its numerous overseas territories, or dom-toms, make the country a truly global entity, with a territorial footprint accounting for 18% of the mainland's territory, and with an exclusive economic zone representing 96.7% of the total. Even fragments closer to the mainland and fully integrated in terms of sovereignty bear a fragile visual relationship to the states they attach to. Akin to diacritics, their relationship to their continental state feels additive and impermanent. A quick Google search for images of the USA logo map brings up outlines of the mainland without Alaska or Hawaii. In the rare instances like this one, where the two states are included, it often feels like an afterthought. Reduced in size, they are tucked in where space allows. The visual representation matters. When territories are left out, they fall out of mind. The fact that the United States outline never includes distant territories, such as American Samoa or Guam, has clear repercussions on the place of these territories in American consciousness. As the recent example from early 2021 showed, US representatives themselves are not always necessarily aware that these islands are American. Of course, there are also undeniable advantages to this invisibility and territorial ambiguities. and the earlier point about offshore bases where different rules apply, or islands that serve as airlocks for the processing of migrants, is an important one to bear in mind. But from a purely practical visual design standpoint, states that are fractured, dispersed, or with unwieldy shapes, such as Chile, are notably difficult to logo map, and this has an impact on the imaginary of the state. Especially awkward is logo mapping of fractured territory, such as an archipelagic state or a state containing numerous islands. Japan's outline, for design reasons, tend to be reduced to its 5 main islands, since an inclusion of all its northern and southern islands would lose the country's iconic recognizability, the important logo component of its logo map. In the case of Canada, its exact number of islands is ambiguous on account of their land-ice composition, thus making the Canadian North visually blurry. Likewise, the Philippines archipelago is too vast to be represented in its multitude of islands and requires simplification. Like in Canada, the exact number of islands is ultimately reliant on the definition of what constitutes an island. So while the official number is 7,107, it may in fact be more. The country's mapping agency announced in 2016 that they had found 534 others. Fractured yet connected, archipelagic states hang together as a cluster. Their geographical and visual coherence relies on an unspoken premise of gravitational pull, the assumption that proximity bespeaks kinship and belonging. Archipelagic logo maps thus work best with groups of islands that are tightly clustered together, another reason why a dispersive archipelago such as Japan tends to be reduced to its core islands, despite the effective prominence of disputed islands such as Senkaku or Takeshima in Japanese political consciousness. In the modern cartographic imagination, which is geographic rather than hydrographic, what is holding the archipelago together is a negative space, an absence. The watery expanse breaks the archipelago into its constituent fragments, but at the same time, it is the negative space that holds them together. In recent years, China has attempted to make this explicit by giving equal weight to its land and water. Unlike previous maps that depicted non-contiguous territories in cutaway boxes, the new so-called vertical map is singular and continuous, and includes the vast body of water south of Hainan Island. In the new map, the land, islands, and claimed waters in the South China Sea are all featured on the same scale in one complete map, thereby placing the islands, but also the entirety of the maritime space, in direct visual equivalence with the mainland. As the map press editor-in-chief told the state media agency, this new map helps correct misconceptions that territories carry different weights, and it fosters a raised territorial awareness and marine consciousness within the public. More dramatically, in 2016, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs launched a visual campaign about its disputed borders. A poster entitled, "Do You Know the Shape of Japan?" highlights 3 tension points: the Northern Territories, Takeshima, and Senkaku Islands, disputed with Russia, Korea, and China respectively. What is radical about this map is less the territorial claims that it stakes than the confident demarcation of a terraqueous entity neatly defined against an undifferentiated background. The poster's outline distinguishes between Japanese and non-Japanese waters, gives equal visual weights to both land and sea, and seeks, through explicitly pedagogical means, to foster effective attachment to these modern human geographies. These deployments of territorial claims beyond terror frequently overlap with other states' attempts to embrace the terraqueous. China's so-called 9-line set demarcation encompasses vast swaths of maritime Southeast Asia, impinging on the territorial waters and EEZs of others. The decision by the United National Convention on the Law of the Sea to grant coastal states sovereign rights over extended continental shelves up to 350 nautical miles from the coastal baseline has led to further entanglements. Relating to the subsurface only, these sovereign rights have no incidence on the legal status of the superadjacent water column or airspace above those waters, thereby creating a complicated layering of 3-dimensional space. A similar volumetric entanglement has been described by architect Eyal Weizman in the context of the Israel-Palestine interface, where Israeli territory, in the form of a road linking Jewish Jerusalem, and the West Bank settlement of Gush Etzion finds itself alternatively above and below Palestinian territory. Qualifying in fact as archipelago on account of its highly fractured and dispersive nature, the Palestinian territory is a visually potent example of the relationship between fractured territory and the negative but all-defining space that surrounds it. Broken up into numerous fragments and enclaves and increasingly perforated by Israeli settlements, Palestine's geobody contains within itself the phantomic presence of Israel in that its logo map continues to represent it as a single, uninterrupted space. Fascinatingly, the same iconic logo map is also used to represent Israel, making it, in the word of Yad Wallah, a picture of a geographic schizophrenia, two adversary and asymmetrical nation cells inhabiting a single geobody. The two logo maps are also incomplete, nostalgic, and aspirational. Palestine's logo map is increasingly divergent from the realities on the ground, where territory is interrupted by an ever greater number of illegal settlements, roadblocks, and border walls. Israel's, by contrast, inches towards isomorphism as more and more Palestinian enclaves are being assimilated. Yet even then, this Palestinian space is never fully absorbed and remains liminal and phantom-like. While this political concorporation of two geobodies enmeshed into one is quite unique, it nonetheless speaks to the central premise of this lecture, namely that all states, irrespective of their outwardly discreteness, are never independent or autonomous entities. In fact, as I will argue in the final section of this paper, the more borders and separations are made explicit, the more the other is repressed, suppressed, and pushed out of sight, and the more entanglement comes to structure a state's identity. The very separation and erasure enacted by the logo map and by cartographic and routine visual practices, such as weather maps, mobilizes the phantomatic presence of the other, the monster under the bed. Sometimes the logo map contains within itself the presence of the other, like in the case of Greece's outline, whose islands hug the cartographically excised Turkish coast. But entanglements also occur across insulated and seemingly unambiguous demarcation lines, like that between North and South Korea, whose respective continued existences are predicated on the negation of the other. A few years ago, after a public presentation I had just given on the enclave complex of Bale Hertog Al-Nassau, a member of the audience explained over drinks that the talk had been interesting but had made him angry. Why do they still have this mess? Why can't they sort it out? I hate it. For this individual, deviance from established norms of territorial sovereignty had no place in the modern political system. It jarred with the cartography we have all become accustomed to, and constituted a prime example of what I term the territorial monstrous. Having summoned monsters at various points in this lecture, time has come to clarify what I mean and do not mean by the term. Unlike the statements above, my use of monster does not smuggle in any derogatory dimension, but perhaps self-evident but nonetheless crucial point to make, given that some of the monsters discussed here refer to real existing subjects. They are the individual whose bodies have been designated throughout history as frightening, obscene, animalistic, or impure. Freaks, queers, blacks, women. Feared and rejected outcasts, but also envied and fetishized, these monstrous selves open up realms of alternative worlds. In films and graphic novels featuring superheroes, vampires, or werewolves, the hero is in fact increasingly the physically or socially deviant imbued with preternatural powers, whereas the real monster is a socially chaotic and frequently immoral human society. Following the publication of Jeffrey Cohen's Monster Theory in 1996, the figure of the monster has proven a very fertile notion for scholars in a range of disciplines. As Cohen writes in the collection and in later work, the monster is a transgressive figure and category violator, blurring the binary opposition that govern on basic concepts and modes of self-definition. The monster evokes an intolerable ambiguity between human and animal, male and female, inside and outside, singular and plural, known and unknown, other and sane, alive and dead. The monster must be exiled or destroyed to keep the system pure, yet always returns in the form of the repressed. On the cusp between the frightening and the marvelous, and in spite of its organic nature, the monster is eminently cultural. In evoking the dominant fears of a particular time and place, it is constructed as monstrous throughout the influence of social conventions, expectations, and attitudes. As such, the monster serves a useful analytical figure to further our understanding of what it means to be human. I suggest that the territorial monsters can serve a similar purpose here. I use the productive figure of the monster to examine territorial forms divergent from the ideals of cohesiveness, integrity, and autonomy that are inherent in the ideal of Westphalian territorial sovereignty. Previously appearing in maps at the edge of the known world in the form of sea monster and so-called monster races, and associated with the exotic and the non-Christian universe, the territorially monstrous is now tied to the temporary, the illusory, the extraterritorial, as well as to the forms of territorial discontinuities and misalignments discussed in other chapters of the book, such as phantoms and prosthetics. Enclaves are especially monstrous in that they expose the ways in which states are fitted into one another, and how their outer limits are also those of their neighbors. They reveal, through their enmeshed nature, the enmeshed nature of all states. True to its dual etymological origin of monstrare, show or reveal, and monere, warn or portend, the monster inhabits in fact a remarkable in-between space. Pushed out of sight, its existence nonetheless speaks to the fictive nature of the visible, and it is here perhaps that lays the greatest promises of monsters. Banished but always threatening to return, the monster is the uncanny doppelganger, the messy, the entangled, and repressed side of the logo map, which necessarily structures the non-monstrous. A powerful depiction of this spatial duality is found in the scene of My Winnipeg, a surrealist mockumentary directed and written by Guy Maddin. In Winnipeg, the narrator reports, the city streets are supplemented by back lanes. I quote, "The lanes are illicit lanes, best not discussed, shameful. They receive the breech ends of houses, the side of the homes not meant for polite company. They are the weedy landscapes of shameful abandonment, conduits of refuse removal. Here we strew what we no longer want to acknowledge." Unquote. The opposition between front and back lanes speaks of course to the hierarchical arrangement of social space, with imposing public-facing frontages, supplemented by the more modest entrances and living quarters of domestics and support personnel. It recalls also the alternative, black and queer geographies found in the space of possibilities, afforded by white hegemonic power. Existing in parallel but made invisible and voiceless, these geographies are intricately woven into, and indeed sustained, represented spaces. A potent contemporary example is the way in which majority white communities have used prison gerrymandering to count black and brown inmates as residents in order to inflate their census numbers, and thereby their legislative power in Washington, while simultaneously disempowering the black communities the inmates left when they were incarcerated. Similarly problematic are spaces that elude neat classification, the ambiguous zones across categories such as race or gender. In Maddin's Winnipeg, this is exemplified by the strange case of Lorette, a hermaphrodite street, half front street, half back lanes. No one speaks in Lorette. The blurring of gender and racial boundaries is always troublesome, but perhaps especially monstrous are cases where the very notion of individuality appears to be at stake. Conjoined twins blur that line in fundamental ways that jar with ideals of autonomy and bodily integrity, and feel highly disruptive of Western notions of individual agency. The first course of action considering such birth is separation, even though survival is not a guarantee. In the case of Eilish, a conjoined twin born in Ireland in 1988 and who lost her sister Katie when they were separated at age 3, the experience was highly traumatic, and for a long time she barely spoke. Re-experiencing trauma at the age of 6, when a prosthesis was taken away in order to fit a new one, she decided to name the new prosthesis Katie, a way for her to make the prosthetic a full part of her body and reintegrate a missing phantom twin. Choosing to embrace cooperation is clearly a challenging proposition for a parent, but it can prove extremely rewarding. For conjoined twin sisters Abigail and Brittany Hensel, separation would have led to serious impairment of mobility and independent function, whereas their lateral symmetry provides them with full, unhindered mobility. The Hensel sisters each have their own heart, stomach, spine, lungs, and spinal cord, but share a bladder, large intestine, liver, diaphragm, and reproductive organs. Each twin fully controls a half of the body, one leg and one arm on each side, which means that physical activities like running, biking, driving, and swimming must be a joint team effort, and the twins have learned to collaborate, each sister anticipating and responding to incipient movement in the other. A situation such as this complicates our understanding of an individuality resting on bodily separateness. As their family doctor explains, individuality is a hard concept to embrace for conjoined twins who have grown together. While they are considered separate people, they are always interlinked and intertwined. Intellectually and legally, the two sisters are two separate individuals, each with their own personality, likes and dislikes. Yet they remain physically and emotionally attuned to one another in ways that seemingly blur this distinction. Such forms of concorporation echo in fascinating ways some of the arguments I've made elsewhere, notably the ways in which each sister anticipates and responds to a twin's incipient movement recalls the intersensoriality of geobodies, where common skin binds two states together. What I want to argue here is that concorporation in the form of conjoined twinness makes for a better organizing metaphor than the zero-sum game predicated on competition and rivalry between entirely autonomous entities that informs geopolitical imaginaries. Rather than reject the somatic analogy as illusory and simplistic, I suggest political geography might draw inspiration from the rich literature that has challenged the fiction of the discrete autonomous body to reveal its entangled and multiple nature. Taking that kind of corporeal model as an analogy helps view territorial misalignments not as exceptions or hyphenated spatial hybrids, but as true representations of territorial sovereignty. Indeed, political anthropologists Rebecca Bryant and Madeline Reeves have recently made a similar argument, that the more closely we examine the map of the world, the more we see that it is covered with exceptions. And yet, if geographers and cultural theorists have acknowledged the Westphalian model as fiction, we seem unable to fully jettison the viscerally experienced somatic representations of the state as discrete container, and somehow continue to be taken aback by the breach between de jure and de facto, and the attendant non-linearity, non-homogeneity, and non-contiguity of neoliberal political borders. Entanglements are found at all political borders, including at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between South and North Korea, which may be the most hermetic and fraught of international borders. Separate and entirely distinct political states, yet historically, culturally, and linguistically singular, the two halves of the Korean peninsula recall the concorporation of the Hensel sisters, in that their functioning requires fine attuning to the other. Like conjoined twins, they are intimately intertwined, organically singular. Their destiny is imagined in terms of reconciliation and reconstitution. This intermeshing is visible in the structural opposition between the two, with South Korea depicted as successful, democratic, and modern, while North Korea stands for non-modernity, economic failure, and authoritarianism. This relation is not merely one of opposition, it is also one of mimetic complementarity, with both halves structured through the very existence of the other. South Korean depictions of North Korea as a dystopian nation effectively posits the South as utopian. The more authoritarian and despotic the North is, the more the South appears democratic and free. This dichotomization also means that each side of the Korean peninsula plays a crucial role in the definition and identity of its counterpart. Since each half constitutes the other's negative space, every change in one produces a change in the other. As its doppelganger, each side stands for the other's body double, both complete opposite and uncanny semblant. In an attempt to move away from this mimetic embrace, just like twins seeking to assert their uniqueness and individuality, the two Koreas tend to use two different names to refer to the Korean peninsula. However, this will to distinguish is much weakened by the two sides' strong emotional and symbolic investment in the DMZ. the skin that binds them together. Ironically, the more the DMZ is emphasized as the buffer keeping them apart, the more it defines their twin-like relation. The case of the Korean Peninsula is admittedly exceptional in its decades-long partition and inherited border, but the notion of concorporation can also be productive to describe other forms of somatic entanglements. Speaking of the colonizer-colonized relation between France and Algeria, Etienne Balibar described it as more than one, yet not quite two. To the concept of hybridity, which is, I quote, still too fluid, non-confrontational, or dialectical enough. He preferred to speak of fractals, which open a breach between whole numbers, and may better reflect the ways in which Algeria and France always already contributed a part of the other. Cross-border entanglements are, unsurprisingly, even more extensive elsewhere. The tension between neat cartographic representations of discrete boundaries and the messy realities on the ground has perhaps been one of the most crucial contributions made by border studies scholars. This literature has underscored the dry, abstract nature of political geography, detached from cultural, linguistic, and social entanglements. Working in a different discipline, political geographers have been paying increasing attention to the elemental, looking at the significance of materiality such as air and water for political space, and for borders in particular. Here as well, the tension between a well-ordered cartographic world and the resistance of the material world has opened up productive spaces for scholarly exploration. A third, largely separate conversation within philosophy has emphasized the significance of entanglements and symbiosis between life forms, thereby blurring the borders of species and challenging the assumption of competition as a main driver of evolution. Bringing these three germane interests into dialogue with one another can be helpful in mining the meaningfulness of liminal spaces in ways that are both dynamic and productive. Prompted in part by the global effects of climate change, we are witnessing increasing acknowledgement of and respect for all kinds of planetary connections. No longer mistaking the forest for the tree, a number of influential books have successfully shifted focus from the individual to the amorphous entities across scales that sustain these individuals. From biotic entities organized into clusters of genomes with unstable group boundaries, to organisms such as certain fungi, where the concept of species is largely irrelevant, there is increasingly a sense that coevolution, rather than competition between species, might be a more useful model. A classic example is that of the lichen. Neither green alga nor fungus, as was initially presumed, the lichen is a coevolution of at least three distinct species. A more extreme example is that of superorganisms, such as the armillaria root rot, that spread across whole forests and may well be the largest organism in the world. As Ahmed Singh writes, differentiating individuals becomes difficult, as these individuals contain many genetic signatures, helping the fungus adapt to new environmental situations. Species are open-ended, when even individuals are so molten, so long-lived, and so unwilling to draw lines of reproductive isolation. The notion of the individual as fixed and bounded is now questioned. Nigel Thrift suggests, evocatively, that it might be more accurate to liken humans to schools of fish briefly stabilized by particular spaces, temporary solidifications, which pulse with particular affects. So it is perhaps an opportune time to destabilize certain assumptions we continue to hold about the state. Taking cooperation rather than competition as primary model, idealist and utopian as it may be, conceives the border not as a violent device of separation, but as a permeable membrane. Of immediate relevance to the concerns of my book, particularly reimaginings of individuality, autonomy, and bodily integrity, can cast bodily boundaries and phantoms in a new light. Karen Barre's discussion of the brittle star, an echinoderm closely related to starfish that will break off its exposed body parts when in danger of being captured, demonstrates how individuality is not necessarily contingent on the illusion of the fixity of bodily boundaries. While the ability to distinguish self from other is crucial to its own survival, these categories do not need to be fixed. On the contrary, Barrett argues, their survival depends on their capacity to discern the reality of their changing and relational nature. Pondering further the ontological nature of separated limbs that continue to wiggle and emit light after breaking off, Barrett asks, When is a broken off limb only a piece of the environment, and when is it an offspring? At what point does the disconnected limb belong to the environment rather than the brittle star? Is contiguity of body parts required in the specification of a single organism? Can we trust visual delineation to define bodily boundaries? Imagine the possibilities for lost limb memory trauma when it comes to brittle stars. Intriguing as it might be, the use of the brittle star as an analogy for the state, just like the other monsters mobilized here, can only take us so far. The monsters featured here as figures of othering are primarily intended as inspirational models, suggestive of ways of doing politics differently. I'm going to be 5 minutes over. They are potent reminders, as Barat notes, that differentiating is not necessarily about othering or separating, but about making connections and commitments. There are nonetheless clear dangers inherent in utopian narratives of entanglement, as Eva Giraud reminds us. Acknowledging that the notion of entanglement grasps something crucial about the world, she nonetheless insists on the importance of paying attention to the frictions, foreclosures, and exclusions that play a constitutive role in the composition of lived reality. This last point takes me to the second usage I want to make of monsters. If my sounding of monsters is tied in part to this scholarly focus on entanglements, arguing for the collaborative and complex nature of geopolitics to finally take center stage, the monster is also, importantly, a harbinger of a time of reckoning. An important point I seek to make is that the iterative representational practice of the state as a local map is powerful on account of its simplicity. It depicts the state in a binary opposition of inside-outside, and more importantly, portrays it as internally homogeneous. This very homogeneity is, however, deleterious, indeed lethal, to many citizens in a given state, given that the quest for sovereign agency tend to circumscribe the autonomy of other actors. As the many examples provided in my book make clear, the somatic state that dominates the nationalist imagination tend to be cisgender, heteronormative, and in a first world context, white. Gay lives are rarely publicly grievable, while the differentials in the value of black and white lives is not a point that needs further belaboring. It is in this context that suggests that the resentment elicited by the fragmented and disjointed body of Barler's enclave complex should be read as an exclamation of cisgender, heteronormative anger. The monsters that lurked on the edges of medieval maps have not disappeared. They have been relegated further away in the form of aliens and extraterrestrials, migrating in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, and horror to the confines of the universe, relocated to a galaxy far, far away, as Jeffrey Weinstock notes. At the same time, he adds, monstrous races have often been mapped onto real-world ethnic groups, suggesting an entrenched perniciousness of stereotypes. Embracing the monsters can bring back into the open the body located at the hinterland of national discourse, a body that is multiple, complex, and includes deviations of shape, color, and gender. But while it may be time to give the monsters the center stage they rightfully deserve, we should nonetheless remain mindful of the danger of co-optation, selective cultural appropriation. In the same way that medieval cartography, in placing monsters at the very edge of the map, could tap into the marvelous, while simultaneously condemn monstrous bodies closer to home as the outcome of transgressive sexual relations or the overly fertile maternal imagination, black, queer, and female bodies have long cohabited as objects of both desire and fear. Film, music, and other forms of media have served as vehicles to explore non-normative bodies and experiences safely, while simultaneously silencing them. As rapper Azealia Banks explains in a recent interview, dominant white culture has a history of fetishizing black culture through caricature and stereotypes. From minstrel shows to hip-hop music, white performers have selectively adopted certain aspects of black culture, incorporating them into the mainstream, thereby making them acceptable. As she perceptively adds, it's like white people are running out of whiteness, so they're like lashing onto everything else. Bearing in mind the dangers of cultural appropriation, it remains nonetheless crucial to ensure multiplicity of voices continue to shape cultural and geopolitical narratives. In recent decades, queer, feminist, and black geographers have challenged patriarchal modes of writing, which for too long have silenced and stereotyped minorities. If discursive violence has, at least in part, been deliberate and intentional, it has also been the unfortunate, often reflective, cultural product of entrenched systemic hierarchies. These initially peripheral viewpoints have gained significance and recognition and can no longer be ignored. Similarly, disability study scholars have successfully pushed back against ideas of a body aligned on constricting notions of gender expression, sexuality, and corporeal integrity, shifting the very ground of nationalist narratives tied to a body. As a very brief conclusion, I want to reflect a little on the ways in which these ideas can be taken further in useful and practical ways. Border study scholars, I feel, have a unique advantage to analyze phenomena like enmeshment, collaborations, as well as state power and sovereignty. Our fieldwork sites, inherently found across multiple sovereignties, are perfect vantage points to track the consequences of different technologies and climate change, human environments, and animal habitats. Border studies can thus make a valuable contribution to the literature on more than human entanglements and symbiosis in ways that are both less abstract and more relevant to contemporary issues. The conference's second focus on zones similarly challenges a view of the state that is discrete, autonomous, and lacks dynamism. Privileging the zones that lie across state lines can help dispel those myths and shine a crucial light on multicultural, multi-species, biodiverse, and complex environments. Finally, the third focus on coexistence offers hopeful glimpses into futures that lie beyond the current global context of nationalism, populism, and autocracy. I personally look forward to attending as many panels as I can and draw inspiration from the analysis and ethnographies presented. I only wish I'd been able to join in person and take part in the discussions. I look forward to participating more immersively in the next one. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, many thanks, Frank, for this really inspiring and thought-provoking lecture, keynote. I think we have time for a few questions. I think there are some. Are they? Yes. Rob? Do we have a mic? Or should we take this one?
Hi Frank, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Right, so
Nice to see you.
it's Robert Winstanley Chesters, who you know. So I always wanted to ask you, and this is obviously really a fascinating presentation as always, and I loved your Voluminous Spaces book. You know, that was really Voluminous to Sovereignty. That was great. But I wanted to ask you about an issue about the sort of flexibility of boundaries in Bale Nassau, Bale Hertog, yeah, which you bring up when you say that individual houses get counted as being wholly within the territory of either the Netherlands or Belgium in that context, depending on whether the person in the house is Belgian or from the Netherlands, yeah?
No.
Okay,
no,
it's not that way.
Based on where the front door is.
Oh, based on where the front door is. So if you are Belgian but your house is one of the Netherlands houses, can you choose to change where the front door is to make your house so you can choose the sovereignty of the space, but through personal choice?
It has happened. They call it playing with the border. Sometimes one side was, you pay less tax.
Yes.
On I think you pay actually less tax on the Belgian part. So people used to do that. It's no longer something that is done, that is acceptable. But it was done actually officially recently when they had they checked all the archives and all the documents that they had to actually write where the actual border was very precisely to the centimeter. And an old woman who had always lived on one side of the border discovered that her house was on the other side. So, and she was very traumatized by that. And the two municipalities agreed to move her front door so that she would be able to remain, in Belgium and not have to move to the Netherlands. So it's a really interesting. For me, it's a very interesting place because there's all these tactics to make it look as if the two sides were completely separate, but they're not. They cannot be.
Thanks.
One more here. Tom.
Hi Frank, can you hear me? Tom White here.
Hey.
Hey, yes, that's fantastic and so stimulating. Just a shame that you couldn't be here in person. My question, I suppose, is that this, very, very persuasive, looked at from a political point of view, but what if we think in terms of political economy? And I think what I mean here is the kinds of entanglement and enmeshment and cross-border kind of sovereignty dissolving processes that have been so powerful over the last, 50 years, have been kind of economic ones associated with, processes of neoliberal restructuring and stuff. So I suppose my question is, where do economic processes, where does political economy come into your story, or does it, or how do you account for it?
Yeah, well, I feel there is a gap between actual practices and the imaginary. I'm really concerned with the geopolitical imagination, with the way we continue to imagine states as separate, whereas it's not really the case. If you look at practices, that's not the case, and that's the point I seek to make here, is that we need to embrace this interconnectivity as the base, not as the exception, and to really look at all these enmeshments across borders. So you see that. I mean, I gave a couple of examples, but they seem to be. I mean, what kind of annoys me in a lot of the literature on borders is that we, on the one hand, we recognize that the imaginary, the Westphalian imaginary, is a myth. It's really kind of an ideal, but at the same time, we take it as granted, and we talk of anything that departs from that as exception, and we try to add hyphenated adjectives to kind of twist this idea of sovereignty. So I think it's a matter of imagination. We need to reimagine the state as something that is entangled already, rather than something that is separate. So I think that's something cartography can maybe work on. I mean, look at a map of the world, it kind of sustains this imaginary of discreteness and separateness. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
Hi, my name's Ruth Gamble. I'm from Australia. First time question, ask a long time reader. My question is, I was thinking about this word monster and how you were using it, and it struck me that monstrous has kind of two meanings. One is the way that you're using it, but the other one is as large and huge. And when you were talking, I was thinking about the two different types of monsters in Star Wars. And one of them is all of the creatures that live on the edges, is like what you were saying, and the other one is the Empire, and it's kind of monstrous eating up of all of the different spaces. And I was wondering if, in all the stuff that you've looked at, whether you've seen empires and large states represented as monsters.
Absolutely, I'm so glad you have a question. Because actually I had a whole section which I had to remove in order to stick to the 1 hour, and I realized there's no way it was fitting in. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the monsters is rarely, if you look at literature on monsters, it's rarely small. It's always large, it's always oversized. It's always a matter of these borders, not fitting the borders, expanding beyond. You look at the literature. And I was thinking about Rabelais and Pantagruel. It's like it just eats up the whole world. And the example you gave of this empires and Collins, that's exactly that. I mean, I work on Russia. I'm for me that, the fact that it's contiguous, the fact that Russia always expanded eastwards during its history, it sort of changed the body, it became something that was kind of swallowing up others, but at the same time it was transforming itself into some kind of, territorial monster. So absolutely, yes, this is definitely part of the story. Absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for mentioning this part of collection. Yeah, thank you.
So no more questions. So I think we can get into the break. Once again, many thanks, Frank, for this really inspiring presentation, and I'm looking forward to catch up somewhere soon. So
Me too. I was really looking forward to that. Seeing all
Thank
my
you.
friends and colleagues. Yes. So anybody who would like to ask a question, you can feel free to email me. I'm very happy to chat. If people have similar interests, I'm very happy to discuss things over email. Until we meet again.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks.